It's strange how the past can creep up on you when you least expect it. I hadn't thought about my old house in years, until last week when I found an old photo of it while clearing out some boxes. The house was small but cozy, tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. I was so excited when I bought it 10 years ago. It felt like the start of a new chapter. But now, as I held that photo, a chill ran down my spine. Not because of the house, but because of my neighbor, Steve. I moved in during late spring, and Steve was the first person to introduce himself. He was a cheerful man in his early 50s, with a stocky build and a smile that seemed a little too wide. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, holding out a basket of fresh fruit. "If you need anything fixed, I'm your guy. I've been a handyman for 25 years. Steve lived directly across the street and seemed to always be around. If I was unloading groceries, he'd appear in his driveway with a wave. If I mowed the lawn, he'd suddenly come out to water his plants. At first, I appreciated his friendliness. The first time I asked for his help was a few weeks after I moved in. The kitchen faucet had a slow leak, and I didn't have the tools to fix it. Steve came over within minutes of my asking. He brought a heavy toolbox and worked quickly, chatting the whole time about the neighborhood, the weather, and his fix-it skills. "All done," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. No charge, of course, just neighborly kindness. I thanked him, grateful for his help. After that, Steve became my go-to guy for repairs. He fixed a squeaky hinge on my front door, replaced a flickering light in the garage, and even patched up a hole in the drywall after I accidentally knocked into it while moving furniture. Each time he refused any payment. "You're new," he'd say. "Consider it my way of welcoming you." But after a while, Steve's constant presence started to feel off. He always seemed to know when something was wrong before I even told him. One morning, I was struggling to get my lawnmower started. Before I could even think about calling someone, Steve was already in my yard, toolbox in hand. "Thought I heard your mower acting up," he said with a grin. "Mind if I take a look?" I didn't think much of it then. Steve was just a helpful neighbor, right? But little things started to nag at me, like how he always knew when I was home or when I'd had visitors. "You had company last night?" he asked once, casually. I hadn't told him about my friend coming over, and it unsettled me that he knew. The real turning point came about 6 months after I moved in. I had just come home from work when I noticed something strange. A photo frame on my living room shelf was crooked. I never left it like that. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe I'd bumped it and didn't realize, but over the next few weeks, more things seemed out of place. A drawer slightly open when I knew I'd closed it. A book moved from one side of the coffee table to the other. Then, one day, I found a small screw on the floor in my bedroom. It looked like it came from something mechanical, but I couldn't figure out where it belonged. That night, I inspected the house more carefully. When I opened the thermostat panel, I found a small device tucked inside. It was a hidden camera. My heart raced as I stared at it. How long had it been there? Who put it there? The next day, I tried to act normal. I didn't want to tip anyone off, but I couldn't stop thinking about the camera. I searched the rest of the house and found 2 more, one in the kitchen vent and another in the smoke detector in my bedroom. There was only one person who had access to my house, Steve. That evening, I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. He answered almost immediately, smiling like always. "Hey there, what's up?" I didn't waste any time. "Did you put cameras in my house?" Steve's smile faltered for just a second before returning. "Cameras? What are you talking about?" "I found them, Steve," I said firmly. "In the thermostat, the vent, and the smoke detector. You're the only person who's been in my house." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he let out a chuckle. "You've got it all wrong," he said. "I don't know anything about cameras." I didn't believe him, but I left without saying anything else. That night, I called the police. The next day I was at work when the police went to Steve's house. They searched it thoroughly but found nothing suspicious. No cameras, no tools, no evidence at all. When they came to my house to inspect it further, all the cameras I had discovered were gone too. It was as if Steve had known exactly what I was going to do and cleared everything out. I stayed in the house for another month, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light felt like Steve's eyes on me. He didn't say a word to me after the police visit, but I'd catch him standing in his driveway, just staring at my house. The unease grew unbearable. One morning, I packed my belongings, called a moving truck, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I sold the house at a loss and moved to a new town. Even though I never saw Steve again, the memory of him lingers. It's been 10 years, but I still double-check my smoke detectors and vents. I never let anyone into my house without supervision, no matter how friendly they seem. And every time I think about Steve, I wonder if he's still there, living across from someone else, waiting to help them the way he helped me. The house across the street had been vacant for months. It wasn't unusual for a home to sit empty in our neighborhood, but this one had been different. Its windows were always dark, the lawn overgrown. So when I saw the moving truck pull up one morning, I was surprised. A new family had moved in. They were perfect, almost too perfect. Mr. Johnson, the father, was tall, well-groomed, and wore crisp business suits. Mrs. Johnson, the mother, was elegant, with perfectly styled hair and a serene smile. They had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Both looked like they'd stepped straight out of a magazine, with spotless clothes and bright, almost unnaturally perfect faces. They kept to themselves, never really interacting with the neighbors, never stopping to chat or wave. It struck me as odd, but I figured maybe they were just introverted. Still, there was something unsettling about how pristine they seemed. It was as if everything they did was too rehearsed. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I glanced across the street and saw them, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, standing perfectly still in their living room. I had expected them to be sitting, maybe watching TV, but no, they were both just standing side by side, staring out of the front window. Their eyes were fixed straight ahead, completely motionless. I watched them for a while, thinking it was just a weird moment. Maybe they were tired or just lost in thought. But when I looked again a few minutes later, they were still standing there, the same posture, not moving at all. It felt wrong. No one just stands still like that. I tried to push it out of my mind, but over the next few days, I noticed more strange behavior. Every time I glanced at their house, they were standing there in the living room, staring outside, motionless. And it wasn't just at night. Sometimes it was in the middle of the afternoon. They didn't blink, didn't move. It was as though they were waiting for something, or perhaps just watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few weeks, I began to notice something else. Some nights, when the sun went down, people would show up at their house. They were always strangers, people I'd never seen in the neighborhood before. They'd come and park their cars in the driveway, and after a while, the lights would go on inside the house. The Johnsons would let them in, but they wouldn't come out again for hours. It was odd. Normally, guests at least leave at a reasonable hour, but these people stayed late into the night. It wasn't like a typical dinner party. There was no laughter, no sounds of people enjoying themselves. Instead, it felt like there was something rehearsed about it, like they were all playing a part in some secret performance. I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on inside that house. It felt wrong, like I was missing something. And that's when the idea first crossed my mind. Maybe I should check things out for myself. I knew it was wrong to snoop. I knew it wasn't my business. But the more I thought about the strange behavior, the more I needed to know. I had to look inside. One evening, after seeing the usual guests arrive, I decided to act. I waited until I was sure everyone was inside and the lights were off, then slipped out of my house and walked across the street. I was careful not to make any noise, and I made sure to stay out of view of the windows. The house was dark, but I could see the outline of the Johnsons' living room through the curtains. I approached the window quietly, peering through a gap in the curtains. What I saw made my heart race. The Johnsons, along with their guests, were standing in a circle in the middle of the living room. They weren't talking, and there were no chairs, just a perfect circle of people standing motionless. They were all facing inward, their eyes wide open, staring at nothing in particular. The strangest part was the way they stood. Their bodies were rigid, as if they were frozen in place. Their heads tilted slightly back, as if they were listening to something. No, waiting for something. The silence in the room was deafening. The air felt thick, like something was about to happen, but nothing did. They stood there for what felt like an eternity. I had never seen anything like it. No one behaved like this. This wasn't a typical gathering. This was something else. Something ritualistic. I should have left right then, but I couldn't. I felt trapped by the scene in front of me, drawn to it, as though I had to see the rest. But before I could step back and retreat, one of the people in the circle turned their head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet mine through the window. I froze. For a second, I thought they hadn't seen me, but then the person's eyes locked onto mine, unwavering. I quickly pulled away, my heart hammering in my chest. I stumbled back across the street to my house, trying to steady my breath. My mind was racing. What had I just witnessed? Who were these people? And what kind of cult-like thing were they involved in? The next morning, the house was silent. The cars were gone, and there were no signs of life. At first, I thought it was just another quiet day, but as the hours passed, I realized the Johnsons weren't home. In fact, they were nowhere to be found. There was no sign of any of the guests either. I watched their house carefully, expecting them to return, but they never did. By the next day, I knew something was wrong. The house was completely empty. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. It was like they had disappeared overnight, vanishing without a trace. I asked a few neighbors, but no one had seen anything. No one knew where they went or when they left. It was like they'd never even existed. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Who would believe me? A perfect family standing motionless in a circle, waiting for something. It sounded insane. But I knew what I had witnessed. They weren't just a normal family. They were part of something else, something darker. Now every time I glance across the street, I can't help but wonder what really happened to them. The house sits empty, like it's waiting for something to come back. I can't shake the feeling that they'll be back one day. And when they do, they'll be waiting. I moved into the house on a warm spring afternoon. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people waved to you from their driveways and kids played outside until sunset. It seemed perfect. I was finally living on my own after years of saving up, and I was excited to settle in. The first neighbor to introduce himself was Jack. He lived 2 houses down and came over the day after I moved in. Jack was probably in his late 40s, tall and wiry, with a friendly smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a plate of cookies his wife had made. We chatted for a bit. He told me about the best takeout spots and warned me about the raccoons that sometimes got into trash cans. Jack seemed like a nice guy, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired from unpacking. A week after moving in, Jack knocked on my door. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said, "but do you have a ladder I could borrow? Mine's too short for a job I'm doing in the backyard." I had just bought a new ladder, so I said sure and handed it over. Jack thanked me and said he'd bring it back the next day. But days turned into a week, and there was no sign of Jack or my ladder. I walked over to his house one evening to ask about it. Jack opened the door, smiling like he'd been expecting me. "Oh, the ladder. I'm so sorry. I'll bring it over tomorrow," he said. True to his word, the ladder was back on my porch the next morning. That was the start of it. Over the next few weeks, Jack came by to borrow more tools, my power drill, a wrench, a pair of pliers. Each time he promised to return them quickly, but I always had to remind him. It wasn't just the borrowing that bothered me. Jack was odd. He always seemed to know when I was home, even when I didn't tell him. If I worked late, he'd make a comment like, "Saw your car pull in late last night. Busy day?" One night, I was watching TV when I thought I saw movement outside my window. It was quick, just a shadow passing by. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains, but there was no one there. I convinced myself it was just a stray cat or the wind playing tricks on me. But then, things in my house started feeling off. My tools didn't always seem to be in the same place I'd left them. A drawer in my kitchen was slightly open when I was sure I'd closed it. The final straw came when Jack asked to borrow my electric saw. "It's for a big project," he explained, his usual smile plastered on his face. Reluctantly, I handed it over, but after 2 weeks without getting it back, I decided to go to his house and demand it. When I knocked, no one answered. I tried again, but the house was silent. Jack's car was in the driveway, though, so I figured he was home. A quick glance at the windows confirmed that a light was on in the basement. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to go around back. His yard was overgrown, and the grass crunched under my feet. I found a basement window that was slightly open. I crouched down and peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was cluttered with shelves and boxes, but what caught my eye were the walls. They were covered in photographs. At first I thought they were random, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I recognized the people in them. They were our neighbors. One photo showed the elderly couple across the street, sitting on their porch. Another showed a young woman jogging down the block. Then I saw a picture of me, taken through my living room window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That wasn't all. On one of the shelves, I spotted my electric saw, along with my drill and a few other tools I hadn't noticed were missing yet. I should have left right then and there, but curiosity got the better of me. I found the back door unlocked and slipped inside. The air in the basement was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. I moved closer to the wall of photographs, my hands trembling. Each photo had a name written on it in black marker. Some had dates next to them. Underneath the shelves were stacks of notebooks. I opened one and found detailed notes about the neighbors, their schedules, habits, and even conversations Jack must have overheard. I heard a creak behind me and spun around. Jack was standing at the bottom of the stairs, holding a crowbar. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice calm but threatening. I tried to play it off. "You left your door unlocked. I came to get my saw." Jack stepped closer. "You've seen too much." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I grabbed the nearest object, a rusty wrench, and swung it in his direction. Jack stumbled back, giving me just enough time to bolt up the stairs and out the door. I ran straight home and called the police. When they searched Jack's house, they found more than just my tools and the photos. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement was a small room with a desk, a computer, and more notebooks. Jack had been keeping tabs on the entire neighborhood for years. He knew everyone's routines, their secrets, and even their passwords. The police told us Jack was likely planning something big, but they couldn't say what. He was arrested and taken away, and his house was boarded up. The neighborhood isn't as friendly as it used to be. People keep to themselves now, their blinds drawn tight. As for me, I've installed cameras around my house and always double-check my locks. Jack might be gone, but I can't shake the feeling that someone else could be watching. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed our stories, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe and stay spooky.